So, Michael, what got you interested in chaplaincy and chaplaincy in the armed forces?
Well, it married two interests. I long had an interest in military history since I was a kid, and I think it's because my dad used to bring us to the War Memorial when I was a kid, when Mum was at her wit's end with 5 kids under 7. But that interest in military history was complemented by an interest in the history of Christianity, and I went on eventually and did doctoral training in history of modern Christianity in the context of the West. So I was approached in 2011 by the chaplaincy department. I just started lecturing at St Mark's here in Canberra, and they wanted someone to write the centenary history of the chaplaincy corps. No one had written this history, and it was due in 2013. So that gave me a hard deadline, but it launched me on this research journey.
I mean, it's an academic job, but it was a labour of love as well.
It was. I was saying to someone that the book kind of wrote itself. I just came across these extraordinary stories of faith, of courage, of selfless devotion.
Yeah.
And so it did become a labour of love.
So the book you named Captain of the Soul, why that title?
Well, I came across the story of Chaplain Hugh Cunningham, who was an Australian chaplain in the brutality and the horror of the Thai-Burma railway and the prisoner of war camps under the Japanese. And he made a difference in that camp. Many soldiers spoke of the tone and the difference that it made with chaplains of his moral fibre and courage, their selfless care for the soldiers around him. The Japanese wondered what he was about because they couldn't see a rank. They didn't wear a rank at this point, the chaplains, and he was treated with immense authority and respect by the other soldiers. So eventually, they weren't sure what he was, but they gave him a little armband with Japanese characters, and suddenly the Japanese soldiers started to treat him with more respect rather than the casual brutality that they treated him with before. Well, he didn't know what that said for the several years that he was in captivity. He came back to Australia, he kept it, and finally got someone to translate it. And it said, Captain of the Souls of Men. Mm. And for me, that summed up the vocation of spiritual and moral leadership that Australian chaplains exhibited in all world wars.
What a wonderful story. Let's go back in history. What were the first chaplains ever?
So we know about chaplains right back to centuries before Christ with Assyrian armies. They had religious functionaries within their ranks. But in the Christian tradition, the story begins with Martin of Tours, a 4th century soldier who apparently saw a beggar on the road, cut part of his cape to give to the beggar, and not long afterwards had a vision of Christ wearing that same part of his cape. And he converted to Christianity, became an important bishop and an evangelist to rural areas of Gaul, or modern-day France. The Frankish kings kept his little cape, the term was capella in Latin, kept that little cape, and they took it into battle with them. And they had clergy who became the keepers of that relic. They were called keepers of the capella, or chaplains in French. Mm. And it's from that term of chaplains embedded with armies that we have chaplains. And eventually the British, during the Civil Wars, had full-time armies, and they had chaplains as part of that establishment. And from then on,
wow,
they're part of it.
Let's jump forward to Gallipoli. Chaplains were actually a part of the forces in Gallipoli.
That's right. I mean, chaplains were there on the first day on the beach in Gallipoli. There was a Catholic chaplain, John Fay, who went ashore with those early waves, and several came after him. There were other chaplains on the hospital ships receiving the wounded. Australian chaplains have always gone wherever Australian soldiers have gone, and they've always had a reputation for being right on the front line. So wherever soldiers were, the chaplains were as well.
It might sound like a funny question, but what exactly did they do when they were in those settings, say in Gallipoli on the beach?
Yeah, chaplains have these multi-pronged roles. So the first is religious and spiritual, so prayer meetings, church services, worship services, rites of passage, praying for the dying, caring for the wounded. There's a practical pastoral element. They're caring about the social welfare of soldiers, so they're writing letters back to the family. They're advising young innocents abroad on the traps of going to brothels or getting themselves into trouble. They're also offering help wherever it's needed, whether that's carrying supplies or acting as stretcher bearers under fire. They had a role in terms of moral leadership, instructing soldiers in morality and ethics. And finally, they had an important role in commemoration. So that was in burying the dead, but also in leading services of thanksgiving, of worship, and really shaping commemoration. Anzac Day, the march past, the minute silence, was all created by an Anglican chaplain, Canon David Garland, and he based it on the Requiem Mass. And his hope was that commemoration would point people to God rather than a kind of nationalistic sentimentalism or idolatry.
I can think of very significant funerals where ministers of religion are leading a funeral in Australia for someone who's died overseas. On the beach in Gallipoli, you did the funeral there. What was that like?
That's right. Well, we have accounts of chaplains who were doing the funerals sometimes at night because it was the only safe time. There was artillery and machine gun fire continually. Some of them took the risks and just did it during the day. They didn't want to leave their men out there in no man's land. So we have some accounts of one chaplain, Mackenzie, who crouched and had all the others crouch as they did the burial service, and they could feel the wind from the bullets and from the shrapnel going past. And he had numerous close scrapes. I mean, they even had, sometimes people were killed during those burial parties.
Mackenzie became quite a hero and a person of some note.
Well, Mackenzie was the chaplain whose reputation took on mythic proportions. He was a bear of a man, massive frame, but that meant he had this extraordinary strength. So he would carry supplies, he would cut steps into the dirt to help soldiers get through. He acted as a stretcher bearer under fire. He was burying them under fire. And he was right up on the front lines on the trenches. At Lone Pine, he was there in the front line trenches before the counterattack, within hours of the soldiers making that first bloody charge to those trenches. He had a great capacity for endearing himself to the men. He had a great care and compassion for them. He was a boxer. He also made an impression on them physically. He had an uppercut that was pretty dangerous as well. So a kind of muscular Christianity that soldiers could relate to. But it was really his demeanour as a kind of father figure. They called him the father of the battalion. He was the dad of the battalion. And after the war, word got around, and all sorts of stories and legends were created about fighting Mackenzie. There's
also stories about funerals in Tobruk, and a particular army padre seeking to do a funeral.
Well, in the siege of Tobruk in the Second World War, German dive bombers would come in and strafe them with machine guns, and it was always quite dangerous to do any sort of work in the open. And as a result, they had several graves dug. So they always had more graves than they had the people they were burying, because as the dive bombers came over, they would dive into these graves, a bit like trenches. On one incident, an Anglican chaplain was reading the prayer book, and he got to the part where it says, "In the midst of life, we are in death." And just as he said that, a Stuka dive bomber came through. They could hear the machine guns rattling. They all dived into these graves and saved their lives.